What you're about to hear is one of the most disturbing cases of deception and murder that I've ever covered on this channel, and trust me when I say that by the end of this story, you'll understand why experienced detectives called it the most gruesome investigation of their entire careers. Before we dive in, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because we cover cases like this every single week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. January 21st, 2025 started as a routine day for the Roseville Police Department. Officers received what seemed like a standard welfare check, the kind of call they get dozens of times every week. A concerned grandson named John hadn't been able to reach his grandmother Patricia Bennett for over 24 hours, and something in his gut told him that something was terribly wrong. Little did those responding officers know that they were about to step into a nightmare that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. When they knocked on the door of Carol Ray's home that evening, they had no idea they were standing just feet away from one of the darkest secrets imaginable. The door opened, and there stood 50-year-old Carol Ray, Patricia's daughter. She seemed casual, almost too casual for someone whose mother had apparently gone missing. Carol lived in this house with her elderly mother Patricia and her 3-year-old daughter Allison. It was supposed to be a multi-generational home filled with love and family bonds, but as you'll soon discover, something sinister had been brewing beneath the surface for months. The officer asked the obvious question, "Is Patricia here?" Carol's response was smooth, practiced almost. "No, she's not here right now," she explained. According to Carol, her mother had decided to stay with her sister because Carol and her son John were having what she called a little bit of a tiff over money. She painted a picture of a stubborn elderly woman who was tired of her grandson's constant requests for money, and had simply decided to ignore him for a while. To the officers standing at that door, this made perfect sense. Family drama over money is one of the oldest stories in the book. Grandmothers get tired of grandchildren asking for loans, arguments happen, people need space. There was nothing particularly alarming about Carol's demeanor or her explanation. She seemed annoyed by the police visit, sure, but that's normal when you feel like your family is dragging law enforcement into private matters. The officers took down some basic information, reminded Carol to have her mother call John to ease his worries, and left. Case closed, or so they thought. But here's where things get interesting, and I need you to pay close attention because this is where the web of lies starts to unravel in the most spectacular way possible. John wasn't satisfied. Something deep in his bones told him that his grandmother was in real danger. You have to understand, this wasn't just any grandmother-grandson relationship. Patricia had essentially raised John. When his mother Carol had been absent or unreliable throughout his childhood, it was Patricia who stepped up. She was his rock, his constant, the one person he could always count on. And now, suddenly, she had gone completely silent. No phone calls, no text messages, nothing. For a woman who had always been so communicative with her grandson, this radio silence was deafening. The next morning, January 22nd, John called the police again. He was more insistent this time, more worried, more certain that something terrible had happened. The officers, to their credit, took his concerns seriously and returned to Carol's house for a second welfare check. When Carol opened the door again, you could see the flash of irritation cross her face. The police again? But she maintained her composure and invited them in. This time, her story had evolved slightly. Patricia wasn't just staying with her sister anymore, she was now apparently at the doctor's office getting her monthly B12 shot at the Weber Cancer Center. Carol rattled off medical details about her mother's health conditions, the pneumonia diagnosis, the diverticulitis that had recently ruptured. She painted a picture of a sick elderly woman making her rounds to various doctors, completely normal behavior for someone Patricia's age with her medical history. The officers asked to see Patricia's room, and Carol obliged without hesitation. She walked them down the hallway, showed them where Patricia's clothes were hanging, pointed out her belongings scattered around the room. Everything looked lived in, authentic. There were no obvious red flags. But Officer Pelt, one of the responding officers, decided to take an extra step. He called the doctor's office where Patricia was supposedly receiving treatment at that very moment. And this is where Carol's carefully constructed story started to crack. The receptionist at the cardiovascular center was confused. Patricia Bennett? No, she's not here today. In fact, her next appointment isn't until February 13th. She hasn't been in for weeks. When Officer Pelt relayed this information back to his colleagues, alarm bells started ringing. Why would Carol lie about something so easily verifiable? What was she hiding? The officers decided they needed to speak with John again, and what he told them next would transform this from a simple missing person case into a potential homicide investigation. John laid out his theory, and it was absolutely chilling. He believed, truly believed, that his mother Carol had killed his grandmother Patricia. Not only that, but he suspected Carol was continuing to collect Patricia's social security checks and living off her money. This wasn't just speculation based on the current situation. John had a history with his mother that made this theory seem not just possible, but probable. Carol, he explained, was a chronic liar, someone who could look you straight in the eye and tell you the most elaborate falsehoods without blinking. She had a history of stealing from Patricia. In fact, a couple of years earlier, Patricia had actually filed fraud charges against her own daughter, though she ultimately decided not to pursue them fully because, despite everything, Carol was still her child. John also revealed something crucial about his mother's mental health. Carol had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and had been on medication for years, but recently she had lost her therapist and hadn't been taking her medication for months. According to her ex-husband TJ, when Carol went off her meds, things got what he called wonky. The detectives sat there listening to John's accusations, and I can only imagine what was going through their minds. A daughter murdering her own mother? It seemed extreme, almost too dramatic to be real. But then John showed them the text messages. Messages supposedly from Patricia but written in a style that didn't match how the elderly woman normally communicated. Messages claiming Patricia was at her sister's house, except when John had driven there himself to check. Patricia's sister said she hadn't seen Patricia since 2015, nearly a decade ago. Messages sent while police were physically at Carol's house searching for Patricia, messages claiming she was home when she clearly wasn't. The evidence was circumstantial, sure, but it was piling up in a way that couldn't be ignored. If you're watching this and your mind is already racing with theories, go ahead and drop a comment below with your thoughts. What would you do if you were the detective on this case? And if you're not already subscribed to this channel, hit that button now because we're about to get into the part of the story that will absolutely blow your mind. The detectives decided to return to Carol's house one more time, but this time they weren't leaving without answers. When Carol opened the door for the third time in 2 days, you could see the panic starting to creep into her eyes. Her story changed again. Now Patricia wasn't at the cardiovascular center, she was at the Weber Cancer Center getting treatment for her leukemia. The detectives asked how Patricia had gotten there, and Carol said her sister had driven her. The same sister who claimed she hadn't seen Patricia in nearly 10 years. The same sister whose address and phone number Carol conveniently didn't have. The detectives asked Carol to call her mother right then and there, and this is where Carol's performance really started to fall apart. She dialed the number, put it on speaker, and they all waited as it rang and rang with no answer. Her hands were shaking. Her voice, which had been so confident during the previous visits, now wavered. When asked why Patricia couldn't just speak directly to John to put everyone's mind at ease, Carol had no good answer. Detective Jerebeck was called to the scene, and he knew immediately that they were dealing with something serious. Carol was exhibiting all the classic signs of someone hiding a terrible secret. She was overly defensive, her stories kept changing, and most importantly, she seemed more concerned about the police presence upsetting her daughter than about the fact that her supposedly sick elderly mother was missing. The detective made a decision. They needed to search the house. But here's the legal complication: Carol refused to give consent. In the United States, police generally need either a warrant or consent to search someone's property, and Carol was smart enough to know that. She kept saying she didn't want to sign anything, didn't want to get in trouble. The detectives were stuck, until they remembered that Carol had a boyfriend named Ricky who had been living in the house. This is where the legal system has an interesting loophole. If Ricky lived in the house and had access to common areas, he could give consent to search those areas regardless of Carol's objections. The detectives found Ricky and asked him point-blank, "When was the last time you saw Patricia?" Ricky seemed genuinely confused. It had been about a month, he said, maybe longer. Carol had told him Patricia was staying with her sister. Would he consent to a search of the property? Ricky didn't hesitate. Of course, he said. He had nothing to hide. If Patricia was missing, he wanted to help find her. The officers started in the backyard, checking every corner, looking through the vehicles parked there. Nothing. Then they moved to the garage, and this is where I need you to really picture the scene because what happened next is something straight out of a horror movie. One of the officers opened a large plastic storage container, the kind you might use to store holiday decorations or old clothes. The smell hit him immediately. It was the unmistakable odor of decomposition, of death. Inside, partially covered by blood-soaked towels, was a human body. Patricia Bennett. The officer stumbled back, calling out to his colleagues. "She's in here," he said, his voice tight with shock. "There's a body. She's in the garage." Within minutes, the scene transformed into a full-scale criminal investigation. Crime scene tape went up, additional officers were called, and Carol Ray was placed under arrest for the murder of her mother. But the investigation was far from over. In fact, the detectives still had some crucial questions that needed answers. How exactly did Patricia die? When did it happen? And most importantly, was Ricky involved? Carol was transported to the police station and placed in an interrogation room. Hours passed as she sat there alone with her thoughts, knowing that her lies had finally caught up with her. When the detectives finally entered the room to question her, they employed a strategy that law enforcement often uses with suspects who might be on the edge of confessing. They were sympathetic, understanding, non-judgmental. They gave her every opportunity to explain what had happened, to tell her side of the story. And you know what? Carol took the bait. She started talking, and the story she told was carefully crafted to make herself seem like a victim of terrible circumstances rather than a cold-blooded killer. According to Carol, it was all a tragic accident. She claimed that one night, somewhere between 1 and 4 in the morning, she and her daughter were sleeping when she heard a loud crash. Fearing that someone had broken into the house, she grabbed her gun, a Ruger pistol, and started walking down the hallway to investigate. Her mother Patricia was sleeping on the couch in the living room. As Carol crept through the dark house with her finger on the trigger, like an idiot, those were her own words, she tripped over something. The gun went off. The bullet struck her mother. Carol said she rushed to Patricia's side, shook her shoulder, heard gurgling sounds, and realized with horror what had happened. She pulled her mother onto the floor and saw blood coming from her mouth. She was in shock, panicking, unable to process what she had done. Now, if you've watched enough true crime, you know that detectives are trained to spot inconsistencies in stories, and Carol's account had problems from the very beginning. First, let's talk about her emotional state during this confession. When someone recounts a genuinely traumatic accidental killing, especially of their own mother, they typically break down. They struggle to form complete sentences. They stutter, they cry uncontrollably, they have trouble remembering specific details because trauma affects memory formation. But Carol? Carol cried, sure, but she managed to deliver a remarkably detailed and coherent timeline of events. Her sentences were complete. Her narrative had a clear beginning, middle, and end. To trained investigators, this suggested that her story might not be entirely truthful, that she had had time to rehearse and perfect her version of events. But the detectives played along. They nodded sympathetically. They told her they understood how scary it must have been. And then they asked her to explain what happened after the shooting. Carol claimed she panicked and didn't call the police. Instead, somehow, she managed to move her mother's body from the living room, through the house, and into a large plastic storage container in the garage. The detective seized on this detail. How exactly did you move your mother's body? They asked. Patricia wasn't a small woman, and Carol, recovering from her own health issues, didn't seem physically capable of moving a dead body that distance by herself. Was Ricky there? Did he help? Carol insisted that Ricky knew nothing about it, that she had done it all herself, but she couldn't or wouldn't explain the logistics of how that was possible. The detectives pressed harder. They asked about the storage container, about how long Patricia's body had been there, about what Carol had been doing for the past 2 months while her mother decomposed in the garage. And then they dropped the bombshell that would completely destroy Carol's story. The medical examiner had done a preliminary examination of Patricia's body, and they had found something that Carol hadn't mentioned at all. In addition to the gunshot wound, Patricia had 2 fresh, deep stab wounds. Not old scars, not accidental cuts, but deliberate stab wounds that had been inflicted around the time of death. The detective leaned forward and asked Carol directly, "Can you explain how your mother ended up with knife wounds?" Carol went silent. This was the moment when her carefully constructed story fell apart completely. There is no way to accidentally stab someone twice while also accidentally shooting them. This was clear evidence of intentional violence, of a deliberate act of murder. The detective gave her one more chance to come clean. "Did you mean to kill your mother?" he asked. Carol's response was barely audible. "No," she whispered, but the evidence said otherwise. While Carol sat in the interrogation room, spinning her increasingly unbelievable tale, other detectives were interviewing Ricky. They needed to know if he was an accomplice, if he had helped Carol commit or cover up this murder, if he had been living in that house knowing full well that his girlfriend's mother was decomposing in the garage. Ricky's interview was completely different from Carol's. He was cooperative, calm, and seemingly genuinely shocked by the news of Patricia's death. "When was the last time you saw Patricia?" the detective asked. "About a month and a half ago," Ricky replied, "maybe longer. It was before Thanksgiving." He explained that Carol had told him Patricia was staying with her sister, and he had no reason to doubt her. He described Carol as the world's greatest actress, someone whose bipolar disorder made it nearly impossible to tell when she was lying or telling the truth. He admitted that he had caught her in lies before, that she had even cheated on him, but he loved her daughter Allison and had been trying to make the relationship work. The detectives asked Ricky about the garage. "When was the last time you were in there?" Ricky thought for a moment. "Early December," he said. "We went looking for a screwdriver." It had been weeks. The detective then delivered the news: Patricia's body had been found in the garage, in a storage container, with a gunshot wound and stab wounds. Ricky's reaction was not the reaction of a guilty man. He didn't get defensive. He didn't lawyer up. He didn't try to shift blame. Instead, he looked genuinely devastated and betrayed. He explained that Carol had been messing with his head for months, lying to him about everything, and now he was learning that she had murdered her own mother and let him live in the same house as the body. After hours of interrogation, the detectives concluded that Ricky was innocent. He had been manipulated and lied to just like everyone else in Carol's life. He was released without charges. Now let's piece together what actually happened, because this is where the case gets truly disturbing. Based on the evidence collected by investigators, Patricia Bennett was murdered by her daughter Carol sometime in November of 2024, roughly 2 months before her body was discovered. The murder was not an accident. The combination of gunshot and stab wounds indicated intentional violence. Carol then hid her mother's body in a plastic storage container in the garage and continued living her life as if nothing had happened. For 2 months she lied to everyone: her son John, her ex-husband TJ, her boyfriend Ricky, her 3-year-old daughter, and when Patricia's family started asking questions, Carol created an elaborate fiction about her mother staying with relatives and going to doctor's appointments. But why? What could possibly motivate someone to kill their own mother, and then live with the body for months? The answer, as it so often is in cases like this, comes down to money. Patricia Bennett was receiving Social Security benefits and possibly other forms of income. Carol had been struggling financially. She had no job, mounting medical bills, a young daughter to care for, and a history of financial disputes with her own son. Patricia had been generous with her money, helping Carol with bills, even buying vehicles for her grandchildren, but there had also been tension. John owed Patricia money. There had been arguments. Patricia had even filed fraud charges against Carol in the past, suggesting this wasn't the first time Carol had tried to steal from her mother. Investigators believe that Carol saw her mother not as a parent to be loved and cared for, but as a financial resource to be exploited. And when Patricia potentially threatened to cut Carol off or discovered that Carol had been stealing from her, Carol made the decision to kill her own mother and continue collecting her benefits. For 2 months, Carol cashed Patricia's checks, used her money, and maintained the illusion that her mother was alive and well. She sent text messages pretending to be Patricia. She told elaborate lies about doctor's appointments and visits with relatives. She even had the audacity to have Patricia's voice text her grandson while police were searching for her. It was a scheme that required constant lying, constant vigilance, and an absolute lack of conscience. But Carol had made one critical mistake. She underestimated how much Patricia's family loved her and how persistent they would be in trying to find her. John refused to give up. He kept calling. He kept questioning. He got other family members involved. And eventually, his determination led police right to his grandmother's body. The legal proceedings that followed were swift. Carol Ray was formally charged with first-degree murder, felony use of a firearm, and larceny of over $20,000. First-degree murder, for those who don't know, is the most serious murder charge in the American legal system. It means premeditated, intentional killing, and it carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole in most states. Carol never did fully confess to the intentional murder of her mother. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence, the gunshot wound, the stab wounds, the months of lies and financial fraud, she stuck to her story that it was all a terrible accident. But juries aren't stupid, and neither are judges. The evidence against her was insurmountable. Think about what this case really represents. A 3-year-old girl named Allison lost both her grandmother and her mother in one terrible act of violence.
The family's not aware of.
She'll grow up knowing that her mother murdered her grandmother
this woman here
and then
is
forced her
your
to
mother
live in the same
hiding
house
your
as the
grandmother
body
from you. For what
John
reason?
lost the grandmother
She's
who
trying to take
raised
the money
him and
from
has to
her
live
that
with
you
the
think is
knowledge that his
entitled to
own
you.
mother committed this
Okay,
homicide.
I don't know.
TJ
Your
lost
grandmother-
his ex-mother-in-law, someone who
Raised
had
you,
been
okay.
part of his
Okay.
life for decades.
Generally, yes.
Ricky was betrayed by someone he loved and trusted,
Right, okay.
manipulated into unknowingly living alongside a murder victim. And Patricia herself, a 69-year-old woman with health problems who should have been able to spend her final years in peace, was killed by the daughter she had supported
Well,
and
if she's
loved throughout
dead,
her entire life.
Then,
The Roseville
she's
Police
got a
Department
body
called
hiding
this one of the
somewhere
most gruesome
or
and
is done away
disturbing
with her.
cases they had ever worked on,
and then trying to
and I
collect Social
think it's
Security or
easy
whatever
to
she
see why.
receives.
This wasn't a crime of passion,
grandma
a
has
sudden
fraudulent,
eruption of violence during an argument. This was calculated.
When was it?
Carol had to shoot her mother,
A couple years ago?
stab
Okay.
her twice
And what
to
happened to those
ensure she
charges?
was dead,
I think my
move the
grandmother
body, hide
decided
it,
to
clean
not
up the
pursue
crime
them.
scene,
Okay.
and then spend months lying to everyone around her while continuing to profit from her
I'm not trying
mother's
to
death.
get her in trouble, but why
That
would you keep lying,
requires a
lying,
level
lying?
of coldness,
So that's why
of
I'm thinking that
detachment from
nothing's
normal
adding
human
up.
emotion that most of us simply cannot
My grandma
comprehend.
just texted me, I guess.
It's the kind
Okay.
of
So
evil
the
that
cops in my
keeps
house
detectives up at night, that makes
grandma's not at
families
the house.
question everyone around them.
John's
That reminds
claims
us all
are
that sometimes
frankly
the greatest danger
terrifying.
comes from
Not
the
only does he
people who are
suspect his
supposed to
mother
love
of
us
stealing from
most.
Patricia and using
If
her
you've
money,
made it
but
this
he
far in
thinks
the
she
video,
may have
I
even
want to hear
murdered
from
her.
Drop
Accusing
a
your
comment
own
below
mother
and
of
let me know
committing
what
such
you
a
think
terrible
about this
act
case.
is something
Do
officers
you think
need to
Carol's
take
bipolar
seriously.
disorder played a
However,
role in
there's
this
no
crime?
evidence to
Or was this
suggest that
simply
Carol
the
had
act
even
of a
harmed
greedy,
Patricia,
selfish
let alone
person who
killed
saw
her,
her mother
so
as
these
nothing more than a
claims feel
source of income?
drastic,
Have you
unfounded,
ever known
and
someone who
premature.
seemed normal on the
Officer
surface
Jarabek
but
seems
turned
to
out
have felt
be
these
capable
claims
of
were over the
terrible
top as
things?
well. So he
And
would
if you have
lead John
any
to the
cases you'd
station
like
to
me
file
to
a
cover
missing
in
persons
future
report.
videos,
Additionally,
let me
he
know
wants
in
to
the
learn
comments.
about John's history
I
with
read
Carol
every single
and
one,
why
and I'm
he
always
thinks she
looking
may
for
have
news
killed
stories to
Patricia.
research and share
Alongside
with you all.
John would be Carol's
Before I
ex-husband
wrap this
PJ,
up,
who
I
claimed
want
to have
talk about
important
the warning
information that
signs
could
that
help
John
solve the
and other
case.
family members noticed but couldn't quite piece together until it was too late. Patricia's sudden silence was the most obvious red flag. For a woman who had always been communicative and involved in her family's life to suddenly go completely silent should have been an immediate cause for concern, and to John's credit, it was. He trusted his instincts and kept pushing until he got answers. The text messages that didn't sound like Patricia were another crucial clue. Family members know how their loved ones communicate, the words they use, the way they structure sentences, their typical tone and style. When those messages started coming through and they just didn't feel right, that was Patricia's family picking up on the fact that someone else was writing them. The constantly changing stories were perhaps the biggest red flag of all. When someone is telling the truth, their story remains consistent. The details might get clearer as they remember more, but the basic facts don't change. Carol's story changed every single time she was questioned. First, Patricia was with her sister, then she was at the cardiovascular doctor, then she was at the cancer center, then she was back with her sister again. Innocent people don't need to keep changing their story because they're simply reporting facts, not trying to construct a believable fiction. There's also the issue of Carol's past behavior. This wasn't the first time she had been accused of stealing from her mother. Patricia had actually filed fraud charges against Carol years earlier but ultimately decided not to pursue them because Carol was her daughter and Patricia, like so many parents, wanted to believe that her child could change, that love and forgiveness would be enough to set Carol on the right path. But some people, whether due to mental illness, personality disorders, or simple moral bankruptcy, are incapable of that kind of change. They see kindness as weakness and forgiveness as an opportunity to reoffend. Carol had shown her true colors years ago, but Patricia gave her another chance, and it cost her everything. I think this case also raises important questions about how we handle missing persons reports, especially when it involves elderly individuals. Patricia was 69 years old with multiple health conditions including COPD, a history of stroke, and cancer. She was exactly the kind of vulnerable person who should have been the subject of an immediate and thorough investigation when reported missing. To the credit of the Roseville Police Department, they did take John's concerns seriously, and they did follow up multiple times. But I can't help but wonder if there were opportunities to discover the truth sooner. Should there be a different protocol for missing elderly persons, especially those with health conditions? Should officers be more aggressive about obtaining search warrants when family members express serious concerns about foul play? These are difficult questions without easy answers, but they're worth considering as we look at cases like this. The financial aspect of this crime is also worth examining more closely. Elder financial abuse is an enormous problem in the United States and around the world. According to the National Council on Aging, elderly Americans lose an estimated $36 billion per year to financial exploitation, and the perpetrators are most often family members, caregivers, or other trusted individuals who have access to the victim's finances. Patricia's case represents the most extreme version of this type of abuse, where financial exploitation escalates to murder, but countless other elderly people are being robbed, manipulated, and taken advantage of by their own family members every single day. Many of them never report it because, like Patricia, they don't want to see their own children go to jail. They convince themselves that it's just a misunderstanding, that their child will pay them back, that it's not really stealing if it's family. But it is stealing, and it can be a warning sign of even worse things to come. One detail of this case that has stuck with me is the image of little Allison, 3 years old, living in that house during those 2 months when her grandmother's body was decomposing in the garage. Did she ask where Grandma was? Did Carol tell her the same lies she told everyone else? Did Allison sense that something was wrong, the way children sometimes do, picking up on tension and fear even when they can't articulate what they're feeling? And what happens to that child now? She's lost her grandmother to murder and her mother to prison. She'll likely be raised by other family members, possibly by her father TJ, and at some point she'll be old enough to understand what happened. She'll have to grapple with the knowledge that her mother killed her grandmother, and that she was there in the house when it happened. The psychological impact of that is difficult to even imagine. This case also highlights the importance of staying connected with elderly family members and being alert to signs that something might be wrong. If you have parents or grandparents who live with other family members, especially family members who might have financial problems or mental health issues, make sure you maintain regular, direct contact with them. Don't just accept second-hand reports that they're fine. See them in person when possible. Talk to them on the phone, not through text messages that could be sent by anyone with access to their phone. Video chat with them so you can see their face and environment. Ask them directly if they feel safe, if they have access to their own money, if anyone is pressuring or threatening them. Create a system where they can reach out to you privately if they need help. These simple steps could literally save a life. For anyone watching this video who might be in a situation similar to Patricia's, living with a family member who is stealing from you or making you feel unsafe, please reach out for help. Contact Adult Protective Services in your area. Talk to a trusted friend or family member who lives outside your household. Call the police if you feel threatened. You are not a burden for asking for help. You are not betraying your family by protecting yourself. Your safety and well-being matter, and there are people and organizations ready to help you if you'll just reach out. Don't make the mistake of thinking that because someone is your child or grandchild, they would never seriously hurt you. Patricia probably thought the same thing, right up until the moment Carol pointed that gun at her. As I wrap up this video, I want to circle back to where we started. The officers who first responded to John's welfare check had no idea what they were walking into. They thought they were dealing with a routine family dispute, the kind of thing that gets resolved with a phone call and everyone moves on with their lives. But because John trusted his instincts and kept pushing, because those officers took his concerns seriously and kept investigating even when Carol's lies seemed plausible, a murderer was caught and brought to justice. This case is a testament to the importance of persistence, of trusting your gut when something feels wrong, and of the critical work that law enforcement does every single day to protect the vulnerable members of our society. Carol Ray is now facing life in prison without the possibility of parole. She will spend the rest of her days behind bars, living with the knowledge of what she did to her own mother. Patricia Bennett's family is left to pick up the pieces and try to move forward without the woman who held them all together. And somewhere, a 3-year-old girl is growing up without a mother or grandmother because of one person's greed and cruelty. If this case teaches us anything, it's that evil can wear a familiar face, that the people closest to us are sometimes the ones capable of the greatest harm, and that we must always be vigilant in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. If this video opened your eyes to the realities of elder abuse and family violence, please hit that like button and share it with your friends and family. The more people who understand these warning signs, the more lives we can potentially save. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel with notifications turned on because I cover cases like this every single week, diving deep into the psychology of criminals, the investigative techniques that catch them, and the impact their crimes have on families and communities. Thank you so much for watching, for listening to Patricia's story, and for being part of this true crime community. Until next time, stay safe, trust your instincts, and never hesitate to speak up if something feels wrong. You might just save a life.